In this module, we're going to talk about documentation. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. And I guess my concern is there is an ever-increasing emphasis on documentation to the point that documentation and layers and pages of documentation are becoming more important than actually doing audit procedures. So documentation is taking the place of performance, and documentation is pushing the time for performance away from us. So I'm concerned about that. Now, before we talk about that, we got to go back for a second and decide what is the required documentation. What does a firm decide? How does a firm decide to document things? So I'm going to take an example from professional standards, a paragraph. And then we'll look at that paragraph and decide should that be documented or not and why. And then we'll try to extrapolate that to all the other paragraphs in professional standards. Now, we clearly don't have to document everything that professional standards require, but we need to think about it perhaps a bit. Now, as another aside, if a firm says, we require this, the firm standards require that we do this thing, even if it's not required by standards or if it is more than required by standards, it becomes required. And someone will say, you did not do this audit in accordance with professional standards. And you'll say, yeah, but that's just a firm standard. No, if you decide that that's a firm standard, you got to do it. So be very careful and require only what standards require. Standards require it, it's required. If standards don't require it, it's not required. Now you're going to say, well, shouldn't we exceed standards? Should we just comply with the minimum standard, or should we exceed standards? Now, I think there was a time once, rather a long time ago, when standards were a lot less complete. The answer was, sure, you had to go beyond what was purely required in standards, because there were a lot of areas not addressed by standards. But what we now have is international standards. They are very complete in every aspect. They are complete. International experts have determined that nothing is missing from standards. Everything that needs to be there is there. So I think the requirement now is you comply with standards, because the minimum standard and the maximum standard are the same thing. So comply with standards, make sure that you've documented compliance with standards. So let's look at this particular paragraph, 227. It's a quality management requirement. And it says, in accordance with 200, the engagement team is required to plan and perform the audit with professional skepticism and to exercise professional judgment. Well, some observations. 227 duplicates 214 and 15. And 214 and 15 are actually more complete than 227. So that's kind of annoying that we have the same standard twice in the book, and sometimes we have them 3 or 4 times. And this is an annoying standard setter habit, and it can lead to extra work, extra documentation, duplication. For instance, if you compare 240 and 315, 240 is about what we do for fraud. 315 is about what we do for both fraud and error. So 240 basically repeats 315. So this is an annoying habit, and you can lead yourself into some confusion, because if you follow 240 and then you follow 315, you could end up contradicting yourself or duplicating work. So you're probably better off to follow 315 with an eye to what 240 says on fraud. 315 is about fraud and error, and just say, okay, so while I was doing this, I considered material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, and I considered all the things I was supposed to in 240 as well. And this is going to become perhaps even more duplicative and annoying with the new exposure draft on fraud. Now, is there documentation required of this particular paragraph? Well, there is no documentation requirement in 200, which is what this refers to. And the documentation requirement in 220 refers to 230 and is less complete than 230. And 230 does not refer to either professional judgment or professional skepticism. So I've got a complex web of 3 sets of standards that we have to read our way through to determine whether or not we have to document the requirements of this particular paragraph. So it's a bit complex, but I think the first answer is no. There is no requirement to document this because it doesn't say it anywhere. It doesn't explicitly say, and you shall document what happens in that paragraph. Now, one of my other favorite paragraphs, 230A7, let's look at that briefly and see if that gives us some help. However, it is neither necessary nor practicable for the auditor to document every matter considered or professional judgment made in an audit. Particularly mentions professional judgment. Great. Further, it is unnecessary for the auditor to document separately, as in a checklist, for example, compliance with matters for which compliance is demonstrated by documents included within the audit file. Now, that's said 4 or perhaps 5 times in standards, sometimes a little less completely than it is here. This is the most complete statement. And the other thing that this kind of says is that using professional judgment and professional skepticism is probably otherwise apparent. So this is one of the things that it's not necessarily to separately document because it's otherwise apparent. The other thing, by the way, that this does kind of in reverse, it says, hey, checklists are okay. It's okay for you to document things in checklists, and it's pretty clear. And it says, and here's a case where you could use a checklist, but you don't have to. So let's specifically consider, and this is perhaps in too much detail, but let's go through, do we need to document what 220 paragraph 7 requires us to do? Document that we use professional judgment and professional skepticism. And what should the firm require? Well, the first choice is no specific documentation. Our support for that is 230A7, and we've decided we don't need to do anything specifically about that. Maybe you're going to have an overall checklist step. During the course of the audit, the partner, all the staff used professional judgment and professional skepticism. Or maybe you modify that around a little bit. The engagement partner encouraged all staff to use professional skepticism and professional judgment. Tick, and document and date, or date and initials, and it's there. Now, this is an attitude. An attitude, it is difficult to document that you had an attitude. It's difficult to document that you were alert. It's difficult to document that you were skeptical, other than by saying, okay, I was skeptical. Now, maybe that's just more than a required reminder, and maybe it's already done because of Section 230. But maybe you might decide, you know what, I'm just going to include a checklist step. The partner will initial that the partner was skeptical, and the partner encouraged staff to be skeptical, and we're good. Doesn't take that long. Useful reminder, yeah, I should be skeptical. Now, those people that like layers and layers and piles of documentation, maybe you're going to say, well, I want to document that all the staff were skeptical, all the way down. So I'm going to put in a requirement that all staff on the engagement have to be skeptical, and so therefore there's going to be a checklist, and they're going to initial and date it, so they will say they were skeptical, they used judgment. Now, if you want to do that, you got to do it, and if you fail to do that, you have failed to follow professional standards, and you failed to follow the requirements of that paragraph because you haven't documented that people were skeptical. And the problem with this, of course, is you have 10 people on the engagement, and they've all signed the form. But it turns out that an 11th person was around for a couple of hours of chargeable time, and they didn't sign the form. So either you're going to have a failure, or you're going to have to spend a bunch of time going through work in process to make sure that everyone who charged even a fraction of an hour to the job has signed the form. So a very complex process to select. And I don't know that it particularly is any better than just an overall checklist step. Or, argue, well, it's documented in the file, otherwise documented that we were skeptical. Now you want to be even more complete. So you're going to know it's not enough just to have staff once document that they were skeptical. We're going to have them do it every day. So we'll have 10 people, and every day in the morning, everybody will sign off the step. Now, more time is wasted, more time is spent. Probably you're starting to get staff to treat this as just a tick box. We're not really thinking about what we're doing. Much more work. And again, you have the problem if you forget someone, and if you forget someone for a day, now you can't go back and have them complete it because the day is passed and it's got to be dated. A lot of work. And let's get really silly. We will gather all staff together in the audit room in the morning, and we will videotape all staff saying, I am confirming that today I'm going to be professionally skeptical, and I'm confirming today I'm going to use professional judgment. Now that's really, really, really beautiful documentation, but it's also really, really time wasting. And again, if you require something like that, well, you've got to do it every day. You have no choice. So as we're thinking about this and thinking about having checklists or memos, one of the things I worry about with a checklist and a memo is you will contradict yourself. So if you have a checklist to prompt yourself to do things, and then you decide to take additional time to write a memo, you've got to be very, very careful that you don't contradict the memo, what you do in the memo, with what you said on the checklist. The other thing is you got to remember, for instance, you've got to document who did it and the date they did it. So if you're going to write a memo based on a checklist, you've got to write down on such and such a date, this staff person did this, and on the following day, another staff person did that. So you're really at risk that you're going to duplicate and possibly contradict, or you're going to have stuff in the checklist that's not in the memo, or stuff in the memo that's not in the checklist. So got to be very, very careful about selecting a memo to document something on when you're also having a checklist. Now, some people I see pick the most detailed, complex, and duplicative set of forms, and the more pages of documentation they have, the better they are. They were the kind of people that would like to videotape everyone pronouncing that they are skeptical. Think you can tell, I think that's a waste of time and probably counters performance. Like we're just spending all our time documenting stuff. We give up on actually doing audit work. Now, as we go through standards, we're going to see that there are some things that we just must document, must explicitly document. For instance, 239B says you've got to document who did the procedure and the date they did it. And that's also in the review engagement section, same requirement. So the checklists or forms must accommodate this for each step. Here is a step we did. Don't care what the step is. Here's a step we did. Here's who did it. Here's the date we did it. I see some people design forms whereby they have a whole page of steps and they have a signature and date at the bottom. I worry about that because perhaps all the steps weren't done on the same day, and that's not in accordance with 230. Also, in a larger audit, it may be that not all the steps were done by the same person. So I don't particularly like that. Has to be who and date. Also, who reviewed and the date. And the extent of the review has to be documented. The extent of the review can be included in the wording on the checklist or the form. Some things I think have to be accommodated by the checklist structure. For instance, 330.28b. You must document the linkage of procedures to the assessed level of risk of material misstatement. And that's required, and it needs to be explicit. Now in 315, we assess risk of material misstatement and specify procedures. But what this says is you've got to link it back. Having done the procedures, you need to have a methodology somehow or other, and it would be nice if it was implicit in the checklist structure where you said, these are the procedures I performed. They were linked this way to the risk of material misstatement, and I'm satisfied that I've addressed the risk of material misstatement. That needs to be explicit. That's something that the checklist or form structure is going to have to accomplish. Sometimes it can be a checklist prompt. I documented materiality and the number is here. And 320.14 says you got to document materiality and performance materiality. So perhaps we need 2 boxes on the checklist where you fill in your conclusion as to your professional judgment, as to materiality and performance materiality. So it can't just be a question, did you document materiality? Yes, it has to be, I documented materiality and here it is, or I documented materiality and see the following working paper. Now you need to write it down, you have to, you're required, but you don't need to write down the reasons. And if you did write down the reason in standards is, I determined materiality by using professional judgment and considering the needs of users. And that's all you would have to write down. So actually, if you documented your materiality determination, you used professional judgment, you've also documented that you used professional judgment in the audit. Now, sometimes ticking off a checklist box is going to be enough if the requirement is to be alert, and that requirement's in 3 or 4 spots to be alert. And maybe you decide I don't need to document that because maybe that will just be implicit, but maybe just to be complete, you're going to decide, okay, I'm just going to have a box that says, during the audit, I was alert. The one thing I see people sometimes doing is they go, well, I don't think that's enough. I think I need to say more than just I was alert. And of course, it's an attitude. It's difficult to document an attitude or a mindset. But they will write a memo and they will say, well, I was alert and the way I was alert was this, and I was, not only was I alert, I was very, very alert. The problem with that is, and there's 2 ways that's a problem. Sometimes people just go, tick it off. 2 pages, tick it off. Which I guess is no worse than ticking off the I was alert if you really weren't. But I find it's a useful reminder. Oh yeah, I should be alert. Yep, okay, yeah, I'm now alert. Okay. And some things just not. Some things you don't need to document, and you will refer to 230A7. Some things just do not need to be documented. You go, that's otherwise implicit. Now, sometimes I decide to err on the side of a prompt. That would be an example of I was alert. I think I would probably say, I really don't need to document that. I know it's a requirement, but difficult to document. The heck, I'll put in a checklist prompt, a checklist step. I was alert. I'll initial it. I'll date it. Okay, I've satisfied that. So I've erred on the side of a bit too much documentation, but it really didn't take a long time to do. So to focus on performance and not on documentation, tidy up your forms, ask questions only once. Don't talk about something you're going to do to look for misstatement due to error, and then in another place do the same thing to look for a misstatement due to fraud. You're probably best to ask the questions or do the procedures about both fraud and error at the same time. And the other thing, it's probably best if the documentation comes from the performance. So to the extent that you can, as you're doing the audit procedures, it's really cool if the performance of the audit procedures produces the documentation. That will be efficient and effective. So, thanks for listening.